Fun Ideas Productions presents the Fun Ideas Podcast.
This is the Slow Poisoner. I come to you from the future with these words of warning.
It's a hot horror planet. 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 Living in science fiction. Past the point of no returning. We got high on gasoline. And we blew the scene.
Hi, this is Mark Arnold, and welcome to Fun Ideas Podcast number 75. This episode is sponsored by the fine folks at Lee's Comics. Attention comic book fans, Lee's Comics of Mountain View, California has closed. But here's the good news. Lee's Comics eBay store is still going strong with over 10,000 vintage comics, the majority of which are now on sale, for half off. Choose from Lee's huge stock of golden, silver, bronze, and modern age comics, and specializing in Silver Age Marvel titles. You can count on friendly service, accurate grading, and quick, secure shipping backed by a money-back guarantee. To check out Lee's eBay store, go to eBay. Click Advanced Search to the left of the search bar, scroll down to Sellers, and enter Lee's Comics Inc., period. That's LeeScomics Inc., period. Don't forget the period. Lee's Comics is shipping daily with no delays. New items daily. Mention the Fun Ideas Podcast and get a free bonus gift. The pandemic continues, and that's why I decided to record a few more episodes that will last at least until the end of June for your enjoyment. As always, please let me know how I'm doing with your comments and subscriptions and Patreon support. You know my other books, but if you don't, go to Amazon and follow author Mark Arnold. Make sure it's me and my books. You'll know because the books are all about animation, comic books, and music. Any other subjects are most likely by another Mark Arnold. All of my books are available in hardback, paperback, and ebook, except for the 2 cracked history books and my first Disney book, which don't have hardcover versions at this time. Since I assume you're still self-isolating, this is a good time to catch up on my earlier books. As for new projects, I'm still waiting for the Warren Kremer book and the second TTV book to come back to the publisher, and I'm working on my Mad book and second Disney book in the meantime. I'm also finishing up 4 articles for Back Issue Magazine, and I'm selecting cartoons for a new collection by Bruce Bollinger, for which I will also write a foreword. I'm supposed to appear at some point with my co-author Michael A. Ventrella to discuss our Monkeys books on Zilch, a Monkeys podcast, but it hasn't been scheduled yet. I'll let you know. Our guest today is a Marvel Comics legend. Nuff said. His latest book is about the life of Stan Lee, called A Marvelous Life. Here he is, Danny Fingeroth. Okay, on the phone today we have Danny Fingeroth. How are you, sir?
I'm fine.
And I am doing very well, considering the circumstances of this pandemic. But
Well, I'd say fine these days has an asterisk, but fine. Yeah, I'd say given the circumstances and the very strange times in which we're living.
Right. But it gives me a chance to do a few more podcast episodes. Normally I would take a summer break. This is the end of my second year. And then I decided, wow, if everybody's cooped up at home, I'll just keep going and do a few more while people can listen. So,
and everybody home is glad for the break in routine. So
exactly.
You're performing a service.
Yes, that's the best I can do. I can't do anything else. So we'll talk about your book, A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee, in a moment. But I just wanted to ask what I usually ask people. Tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got into working for comic books, writing especially.
Well, I don't know if it's especially exciting. I was a big comics fan, especially a Marvel fan as a kid. I'm of the generation that was when the first, Marvels came out. I mean, Marvel has timely been around since the 30s, but when, I was around for Fantastic Four number 4, actually. That was, I'd been reading DC Comics and other stuff, and then a friend of mine said, hey, there's this new thing called Fantastic Four you might like, and then turned out, it was a changing point in my interests, and I guess in my life, ultimately, since I went into the business, so I was a big fan, but I was not a member of capital F fandom, Actually, ironically, I went through, I loved comics, and mostly Marvel, DC, superhero type stuff, although I remember reading Millie the Model in the barbershop when I was a kid, and then I as people do, as a teenager, I sort of, my interest in the specific superhero comics was waning, although comics as a medium still fascinated me in the undergrounds and Harvey Picar's work and stuff like that. And then I came back from college. I grew up in New York City. I grew up in Manhattan. And I came back from college in upstate New York in SUNY Binghamton, which is one of the fine state universities of New York. And I had a degree in filmmaking, but no real desire to move to California. And I thought, it might be fun to work at Marvel Comics for a couple of months while I figure out what I do. And I had a contact that could get me in the door there for an informational tour, which is what I did. So I went around there, and through that I ended up about 6 months later actually getting a job there as an assistant editor to Larry Lieber, who is Stan Lee's brother, of course, but also a very talented writer and artist and editor in his own right. And he was running the British division of Marvel, and so I became his assistant. And mostly we were doing reprint material, some new material for a character called Captain Britain.
Right.
And so we were doing a lot of new covers and a lot of new splash pages because we'd split up the U.S. stories into chapters. And especially, we ended up doing a lot of Star Wars. I ended up, in effect, being Archie Goodwin's assistant on Star Wars because they were using it at twice the rate in the British version. And so I started doing some writing of splash pages and cover copy and letters pages, and then kind of, in those days, as opposed to being frowned on, it was actually encouraged for staff members to do writing. So at a certain point, the British department migrated. Crazy idea. A guy named Des Skin came along and said, maybe actual British people ought to be putting out your British books. And Marvel went, why didn't we think of that? As opposed to guys from the Bronx and Brooklyn and Manhattan and Queens. So the books migrated. At that point, Larry was drawing and sometimes writing the Hulk newspaper strip. And I had kind of segued into the mainstream editorial department, being a shared assistant, while still holding on to some of being the liaison with the British comics, still assisting both Jim Shooter and Saul Brodsky, which was interesting because they didn't get along so well. So it was interesting being a shared assistant between two people who didn't really like each other, and were at different points in their careers too. And then eventually I became the full-time assistant to Louise Simonson, who was known as Louise Jones when she came to Marvel to run the X-Men books and the Conan books and Star Trek, Star Wars, we had incredible, we had enormous workloads then, and so I took some of the British duties, and I had my own line of reprint comics I was editing, and in there I started writing, and I guess I co-wrote a couple of issues of Avengers, and then I guess my biggest writing break was writing The Dazzler. And so that was that. So that's sort of a very, short. Well, it didn't feel that short as I was saying it version. But I think a lot of it. I was always a writer. I always saw myself as a writer. I'd been on the editorial board of my high school writing magazine, high school literary magazine, and of course, I want to be an artist, and I doodle fairly decently, but never at a professional level. But I mean, nobody starts out. Very few people, I think, at 8, 10, 12 years old go, I want to be a comic book writer. I want to be a comic book editor. The thing you see is the artwork.
Right.
You want to be Jack Kirby. You want to be Steve Ditko. You don't, and then at a certain point you go, oh, okay, but here's what this guy Stan Lee does, and here's what these other, here's what, John Broome over at DC or Gardner. You sort of figure, the pictures are great, but there are people supplying ideas and words, and I mean, I don't think I really understood quite as a little kid what an editor was. Obviously, as I got older, figured out an editor had like a supervisory position, and again, the editor that we all knew. I guess the two editors we knew were maybe Julie Schwartz and Stan Lee, and Stan was so juggled so many other roles as an editor, that even that he was unusual certainly for that era. He was, even though he worked for a fairly large company, he was in retrospect behaving as if he was the owner and founder, and so played all these multiple roles and had the personality to go with it. He liked being in the public eye. So I mean, so that's sort of the evolution, I think, of a lot of people. I did not come from organized fandom. The story I tell sort of in an ironic way. Ironic given if we go through my career, the things I did above and beyond writing and editing comics. When I was a teenager, I went to the 1970 Phil Seuling Comic Book Convention in New York on July 4th weekend, and I went to it and I said, well, that was fun. Now I never have to do that again. That was sort of my approach to skiing. Also, I went skiing once, and I went, that was fun. Now I never have to do that again. So I've maintained that vow about skiing, but obviously the comics.
I was going to say, and how many shows have you been to?
Well, not only have I been to shows, but I spent about 4 years working for Wizard World, going to every one of their shows, organizing and moderating panels, including, once again, being Stan Lee's moderator at many of his panels. So not only have I been to now hundreds of conventions, but I think I've been on, or I've either been, I've either run, moderated, or been the subject of probably about 1,000 convention panels at this point in my life. Yes, that was quite an ironic thing for me to say back then.
Now, when you started out, were you trying to get a staff position there, or were you just trying to freelance, or just anything?
Oh, I was looking for a 9-to-5 job.
Okay.
I graduated college, and I'd come, like every kid, every young person comes home after college. I did too, except since I grew up in Manhattan, there were more and different kinds of opportunities than if I had grown up in and my mother had an apartment in a smaller town. I literally came home and so my financial investment in going for a tour at Marvel Comics was literally a subway token. So it wasn't like I had to go, well, let's see, I have to save up money for a plane ticket and fly to Los Angeles and see if I know anybody there I can stay with, and then I got to learn to drive,
Right.
and rent a car. And I had learned to drive by that point, but I mean, it was in that sense. It's funny. There's a group. I would say that's not an uncommon origin, for local New York young people or middle-aged people even to just go, well, what the heck, this sounds interesting. I think the most famous story being Julie Schwartz, who had been in the science fiction world, but supposedly had never read a comic until he got on the subway in the Bronx where he lived on his way to his interview at DC Comics in Manhattan and bought like 5 comics off the newsstand and read them on the way to his interview. And but I mean that's what I found at Marvel and probably at DC. In the comics business in general, as far as people who work on staff. I'd say half of them are people for whom it's a life goal and something that they were, burning to do. And the minute they graduated high school or college, they got on a bus and they went to New York and they crashed on a friend's floor, and they were not leaving till they got a job working at Marvel or DC.
Right.
And there's a lot, but there were also a fair or equal number of people who were just kind of liberal arts bums, people who had English or film or sociology. They had some kind of degree that was not, not a hardcore career thing. It was just we knew a lot of cool stuff and had read a lot of interesting stuff and met interesting people. And it's like, okay, I'm back home in New York, and what's around for me to do while I'm strategizing the rest of my life? So there were, it was not an uncommon origin for people
and I've heard that
at Marvel.
Yeah. Now, was Marvel the only place you took a tour? Did you try the other companies as well, or was Marvel just the one?
Well, I mean, it's funny. That was the only. I mean, maybe it's a chicken and egg thing. I mean, the only thing I had, I'd been a Marvel fanatic as a kid. But I mean, and as I say, I had a quote unquote connection, but it really was just to get me in the door. It was by no means anybody who could, say, this guy needs a job. So, no, it had never occurred to me. The idea of, say, Warren or DC or National Lampoon. I don't know why Marvel had. I guess because it had such a positive association with my. With my not then so long ago childhood and adolescence,
Right.
It is funny. I mean, I think, I know we're gonna, I'll leave it for you to get to the point where we talk in depth about my book about Stan, but I mean, I think it might have had to do with that relationship that Stan Lee developed with the readership.
Yeah.
That made. That even though you knew he was obviously his, not just the stories, but the letters pages and bullpen bulletins and all the promotionals, even though you knew that all that stuff was being read by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, he had this skill of making you feel that he was really talking to you, and I guess even though it had been years since I'd been a regular reader of Marvel's comics. I guess it still had that kind of magic spell on me that, like, well, if I'm, because I was doing, I was doing other work. I was thinking about possibly going to graduate film school.
Right.
And I had some jobs in the movie business in New York, which at that point was mostly industrials and porn, you know. So, I mean, and I worked in both, although not the glamorous side of porn. I negative matched A and B roll for a couple of porn films, so I wasn't there for the exciting part of them getting made. And then, so I mean, I had a bunch of different jobs, and I always kind of my interests and whatever skills I have were always in sort of creative type endeavors. But yeah, when it came to comics, I just somehow Marvel was the only place, and I didn't get I didn't get a job right away. I met somebody there who was working there that I went to high school with, and I sort of kept in touch with him, and then I mean, Larry Lieber, who I'm friends with to this day, we had like a 5-minute interview in which I like to give my main job hunting interview advice to young people, which is when you go for your job interview, make sure you have masking tape, not just on one side of your glasses, but on both sides of your glasses. I think that's what really... So I'm sorry, you've been trying to ask a question. So.
Oh, no, that's fine. I was wondering if you actually met Stan as well that day, or is it just Larry and the high school friend and anybody else?
I met my most vivid memory, because I don't even think I interviewed with Larry that day. I was sort of like this guy. I mean, because I wasn't actually interviewed till like 6 months later when the job was open. My most vivid memory I remember meeting Archie Goodwin, who was very nice, and I remember meeting, probably the most open and friendly and welcoming person to just some guy working around was John Romita Sr.
Oh, yes, I met him.
Who just couldn't have been... as I later discovered, the guy was doing 5 people's jobs simultaneously. So certainly, if anybody could have said, "Don't bother me," but he was just the very world's most welcoming and friendly and what's the word? It's welcoming and friendly. Just he was kind of. It was as if he was the guy written about in the bullpen bulletins, whereas I think some of the other people were actually nobody was mean. Everybody was friendly, but just John, I remember especially being much nicer to me than just hi, hope we get. Everybody was friendly, but John was especially welcoming, which I always remember, and made me feel always especially warm towards him.
Right. So when did you first meet Stan then? If it wasn't maybe that first meeting, or
as a guy who's written a book about Stan,
you don't remember.
I should have an answer, right? It's
fair enough.
Because Stan was still in the office then. He hadn't moved out. It was 1977. He hadn't moved to the West Coast yet.
Right.
So it wasn't like it was. Like comic book people had in those days, an odd kind of celebrity. Even Stan, who was the biggest celebrity in comics, was he was just in the office, and he wasn't. Archie Goodwin was the editor-in-chief at that point,
right?
And there was an editorial staff. So Stan, I think, was even then dealing with brand extension. He was a publisher. Was his role then. So I would say I must have met because I shared the office with Larry. I'm sure at some point Stan came in to just chat with Larry or something. And certainly if Larry went on vacation, which I think he did fairly soon because it was the summer, then it was my job to get... Stan was still approving all the covers in those days, even though he wasn't editor-in-chief, since he was in the office. So I must have brought him British covers to look at, but I don't have any great... So you would think after 100 interviews I'd have a better story, but that's almost I guess that's become my story, that I don't have a story story.
That's
but I mean,
fine.
I guess I met Stan Lee when I was 8 years old in the pages of the comics. Really, I mean,
Right.
that's
Right.
I sort of met that version of Stan, which was a great version for a kid to meet. So in some way, I'd known him since I was 8 years old.
Right.
And then, and so over the years, I've worked with him a lot, and then, as I say, oddly enough, as much or more after I left Marvel, I worked on projects with him, and got to know him to some degree. But I don't have a great ta-da moment. He was just around, which, I guess that was maybe the difference in Marvel from Marvel even a few years later, because he did finally move fully to the West Coast, I think in 1980.
Right.
But for those few years, even he was just there, and if there was even an internal dispute that got to a high enough level, then Stan would adjudicate it. I don't think he liked doing that, but he he certainly was available.
Mm-hmm.
For that, so I need to either make up a story or something. But I think maybe the company was so much about Stan that that he was a presence.
Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, he made enough of an influence on you, as everyone, to write a biography about him. Was that a long time in planning, or was it just spur of the moment, just saying he's getting older, I better do this, or what?
Oh no, it was about the opposite of spur of the moment planning. It was about 10 years in the planning. I had worked with him. I never claimed I was part of his inner circle. I wasn't. I worked. I knew him for years. I worked with him at Marvel. I worked with him a lot when I went to other companies like Byron Price Multimedia and Visionary Media and so on, because I was the guy who knew Stan. I edited some stories that he scripted at Marvel, and had I was in a lot of meetings with him, mainly in the West Coast. But I'd say about 10 years ago, I was, trying to think of projects to do that would be interesting and that would have some. I've written other books. I've written Superman on the Couch, and Disguised as Clark Kent.
Right.
I've written a number of books that have been very well reviewed, and every convention I go to, people come up to me and tell me how important those books were to them. I did Right Now magazine for Tomorrows, and that Stanley Universe book that I did with Roy, and the How To book and DVD with Mike Manley. So I'd done a lot of stuff that had been well reviewed and even had a certain amount of popularity, but I really wanted something that would be popular for all the obvious reasons that one wants to do something popular.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, let me, maybe I could get Stan to, because I did know him to a certain degree. Maybe he'd want to do an authorized biography and have me write it, and he would participate to a high degree. Or maybe, actually, there was also a book out at that point that the Cameron Crowe had done with Billy Wilder. You remember the name? Do you know that book? You know what I'm talking about?
I know what you're talking about. I don't know the name of it.
Yeah, it was a book where it was essentially a series of interviews with Wilder, but really focusing in depth on his films. Mm-hmm. And I thought that might be something that Stan might be interested in. And I had a meeting with Stan and his people at a convention when he was in New York for a convention. And I pitched him the idea. I wrote up this long, elaborate proposal. And he thought about it for longer than I thought he would. I honestly didn't think he'd want to do it, but he thought about it. And he said, I don't want to do it, but now I'm encapsulating a lot of emails and conversations. But essentially, he said, why don't you do an unauthorized one if you want, and and I won't try to stop you. And so I again wrote a very elaborate proposal for that. I pitched it around to my agent pitch it around, and it got bought by the St. Martin's Press, by Thomas Dunn Books, which is a division of St. Martin's Press, which is a division of Macmillan. And so we made that deal about late 2016 after pitching around to a number of places and having several offers that were all good, but I had to ultimately decide. But there was a lot of gaps in this, between trying to get Stan to do it authorized and then kind of letting it lie around for a while and figuring out if I still wanted to do it, and then pitching it, because Stan is a funny kind of celebrity. Mm-hmm. He's a celebrity, but he's not a celebrity.
Right.
I mean, he's a celebrity, but he's not Tom Cruise. He's not Daniel Craig. He's not a movie. He's I guess as years went on, he became something of a movie celebrity.
Just doing cameos in all those films.
Right. But he didn't have that kind of fame, and so that's what made it a tricky sell to a publisher. Was people are curious about Stan Lee, but are they curious enough to spend money to buy a book about him? Turns out they are. The book has been doing very well, and I'm very pleased about that. So no, it was the exact opposite of a spur of the moment thing. And then when I when I made the deal with St. Martin's Press, I called Stan. I said, "Remember that book we were talking?" And every 6 months or a year, I'd email him. I go, "Remember that book? You want to do that?" Which is when he finally said, "Well, why don't you just do it unauthorized?" So I sent him an email and said, "Remember, you said go ahead and do an unauthorized book." Well, I did. So he said, "Well, congratulations." He said, "I'm not gonna tell people to talk to you or not to talk to you, but I don't want to be interviewed. I've been interviewed too much. I'm tired of it, but good luck." I ended up doing two, very long interviews with him for the book.
How did you swing that?
I think Stan did just like to talk about Stan and about what he thought. But you know what? I live now in the gentrified version of the neighborhood that he, spent his first 20 years of trying to get out of, Washington Heights in Upper Manhattan. Mm-hmm. And up by the George Washington Bridge, and so every once in a while I would. And I've had a lot of contact with him over the years, especially there were those 4 years where I was his regular moderator at the Wizard World shows. But I interviewed him a lot for my various magazines and books. He wrote forwards for Superman on the Couch in the Skies with Clark Kent. And, again, I'm not claiming I was his best buddy, but I had a relationship with him. Yeah. And so I would every once in a while I would send him a picture of the George. And if you know Stan's, even from his own memoir from 20 years ago, or his life story, his personal mythology, is very much tied up with how the George Washington Bridge, which was built when he was 9 years old, right? I mean. So he lived in Washington Heights and the Bronx, but as the bridge was built, it's one of those landmarks that's in every next to the Brooklyn Bridge and the Empire State Building. George Washington Bridge might be one of the main New York landmarks that people know from movies and TV. And So I take a picture of the bridge. Here's the bridge at sunset. Here's the bridge in clouds. Here's the bridge at night. And I would send him these pictures, and he'd go, "Oh boy, I remember that. It really strikes a chord. And thanks for sending it." So I have I like to flatter myself and think that maybe that kind of made him feel nostalgic and that he'd want to talk about his childhood and his early years. I don't know what it was, but at a certain point, he agreed to do an interview, which lasted about maybe an hour and a half, and then a follow-up that lasted another hour and a half, 2 hours, and I had a lot of, it's funny, I'd done many interviews with him both in public and then just over the years. I say for my magazine, I'd had some interviews I did with him, and Roy and I did that Stanley Universe book back in 2011, and I remember it was very funny. I was at Stan's archives in Wyoming, at the University of Wyoming, which is a whole other story. Just to get to Stan's archives is you have to take a plane that's nicknamed the Vomit Comet to get to Stan's archives. And I remember I'm out there, and they're great. The people there are great, and it's a very interesting. It's called the American Heritage Center, and it's really a terrific popular culture archive. And they've decided, at least as far as comics, to make their specialty be comic book editors. So I get a message from Stan's assistant saying Stanley wants to speak to you, and I'm thinking, oh, boy, I wonder what he wants to talk to me about. I hope he's not, his archives are public, so, I was thinking, is he mad I'm at his archives or something? They are available to anybody who can get themselves to Laramie, Wyoming, So I call him back and say, Stan, what's up? And he says, I'm just calling to tell you that you should give your archives to them, too. And I said, my archives, those boxes of random papers that my wife keeps wanting me to throw out, that archives? He said, yeah, they're great people there, and they do a great job, and, you should really give it to them. And I said, Stan, thank you, and you're right, they are great people, it's a great place, there's only one problem. They're in Laramie, Wyoming. No offense to anybody out there in Laramie. I had a very nice time in Laramie, but it is kind of far away from New York or L.A. And he said, I know, but they're great, so...
Wow.
So I guess I'd had, enough interaction with him over the years that... And I think maybe especially those last few years when I was doing the panels with him at the Wizard shows. Because, he had, when I first started working with Wizard, they hired me because at that point, they had an interest in broadening both the depth and the width, of their panels. And a guy named Chris Jansen, they had hired him. He had been working at the San Diego Con doing programming. And they hired him, and I did a couple of panels at a Wizard show in New York, and that's when they offered me the chance to come join the vaudeville tour. and so they let me do an incredible wide range of panels with, anything, pretty much anything I could think of. And so I did a lot of zany stuff, but among that was Stan's people asking me to be Stan's regular moderator, and Stan had other people doing them, and they were different than me. You can tell hearing me, I'm sort of relentless and thoughtful, but I'm not Mr. Showbiz. And Stan did have guys who were like kind of almost like carnival barkers. And I thought, I guess I'll never get a chance to moderate Stan in public, because these seems to be the kind of people they want, these very show busy kind of loud, blustery guys. And that's fine. Stan is certainly a part of Stan that's at home with that. But then they did ask me, and we had, and again, Stan, even till the very end, what he mainly needed a moderator for was to repeat the questions to him, because his hearing was going.
Yeah.
As even towards the end, when there were those very real issues of should anybody even be dragging Stan around to conventions, even then he got on stage, and he was very good, and he wasn't just giving canned answers. You could tell he was thinking about and being funny and giving thoughtful. So, I mean, Stan certainly was not. He needed a moderator to have a straight man to play off and to repeat the questions to him, and I was glad to do that. And and in return, he would go, I got to stop everything now and just tell you guys how great Danny is, and he worked at Marvel for years, and we were crazy to let him go. So I mean, but I think whatever it was that Stan and his people saw about my rapport with him, they thought, well, here. So I guess there must have been some kind of trust there, and knowing that I wouldn't do a hatchet job on him just for the sake of being scandalous,
Right.
So maybe that's why he talked to me, or it could just be that he was bored and felt like talking.
Now, when you finally did talk to him, I guess it was over the phone since you're on opposite coast, right?
Right.
Did you try to delve into his life more deeply than, say, even in his own autobiography or anywhere else, and really get exclusive information, or what was your goal?
The short answer is yes.
Okay.
In other words, I think at that point, I knew enough about comic history and the controversy surrounding Stan, and even his early career that nobody knows about. I mean, the guy worked at Timely Marvel since he was literally 17 years old.
Right.
So I think so I knew a lot about his background, and I knew stuff that even in other interviews I'd sort of not. I didn't probe deeply. I figured there was no point, in saying to him, so what about Jack Kirby? Because, I didn't think I was going to get him, to say anything more about those relationships. But I was able, I asked him a lot about his childhood and about, maybe other women he dated before he met Joan, and why he got into comics and his time in the army and growing up in New York, stuff that that I thought would, and his years in high school. So I mean, I tried to get deeper into things that he rarely talked about. A thing that I pride myself on, because again, I've done hundreds of interviews for my magazine, for my books, for conventions, is that I think I'm pretty good at getting people who've been interviewed 1,000 times to maybe come at the topics at a little different angle, to get them to think about it just at a few degrees differently than the stories they've been telling by rote for decades. And I think I finally was able to do that with Stan, and get him to talk about his relationship with Elaine Renee, his relationship with Martin Goodman, which was very, people sort of, Stan would always say that, he just happened, it just happened to be Goodman's company, and Goodman just happened to be his cousin-in-law,
right.
and they really didn't have much to do with each other. But I mean, they, like all the comic companies, really, they're really stories of family dynasties, and so. So I was able to get a broader understanding and get Stan to talk more about what it was like to be working for a relative, which is always a mixed bag. It gave Stan kind of this velvet line trap where, Goodman could never, as bad as business would get, and when Marvel came close to closing a number of times, Goodman couldn't really fire him, but he could make it painful for him to stick around. And there was a certain way that Martin, I think, always, as much as Stan accomplished and as famous as Stan got, I think Martin was jealous of it. Yeah. I think and there was a part of him that didn't allow him to see Stan as anything other than his little cousin, that needed a favor and a job when he was 17. But I mean, that whole, I got a sense from that, and also a lot from Larry as well. Larry filled in a lot of blanks too, So I think to understand, Stan's successes and the failures too, and what what he achieved and what he was unable to, and so I think I was able to ask him questions that were probing enough that they made him think and reflect and maybe dig up some memories that I don't think he has for other people, without being so confrontational that he would just shut down.
Right.
So I think that came from me having, as I said, done hundreds of interviews with people over the years. The thing that I would always find funny in interviewing people, and maybe I do it myself, but say I'd be interviewing somebody, a well-known comics writer, I used to do for this magazine called WRD right now. And I say, well, how did you break in? And, a lot of times people would say something like, well, I was having lunch with John Byrne, and he said, and I went, wait a minute, how did you get to be somebody having lunch with John Byrne? They'll be like, or Chris Claremont introduced. Oh, wait a minute, I mean, so I'd have to, peel back, the layers of the onion to go, well, look, I know you take it for granted that you've had this success and access to these people,
right?
But, how? But at one point, you were just somebody looking in the candy store window. How did you get? So I think I became and am pretty skillful. I think it's part of what comes with being an editor and a writer too. That you're kind of always kind of peeling away the layers of the onion and trying to see, the deeper meaning of the deeper origins of things. So this, I think with the interviews with Stan, and I also found a lot of, especially thanks to our friend, the internet. But I went to Stan's archives, which I have to say, I didn't find there's an incredible treasure trove there. I didn't have the sense that he redacted anything or hid anything, because there's a lot of stuff in those archives that don't necessarily make him look so good.
Yeah.
So I've been at the archives. I knew a lot more about the history of comics than I ever had, so somehow I was able to take all those different skill sets and knowing him, and I think I found. It's fun, you've done your share of history and biography, so, a lot of it is like Citizen Kane or Rashomon, just kind of, everybody has their different point of view about history, and so that's what I tried to do in the book, because it's not an authorized biography, which meant that I didn't have to get it approved by Stan or anybody else, I just had to, do what I thought was most accurate and fair, and I certainly did my best to give Kirby and Ditko and everybody else, and Martin and Goodman, everybody else sort of their say. That's been one of the most pleasing things about it. The book, by the way, is called A Marvelous Life: The Amazing Story of Stan Lee.
Yeah.
And one of the most gratifying things is most of the reviews have been really positive, but even people who may not have liked Stan have said in reviews or in social media posts that they thought that I was pretty fair in my handling of it. A couple of people have not, and really my feeling reading their detailed criticism is even they in their way were saying that. It seems to me that even they were just kind of saying, oh, well, you interpret these things differently than I choose to interpret them. Yeah. But most people, because look, there's stuff in it that Stan did that was not, that was not always great. My line is that I don't know if it's a spoiler alert, but something I say near the end is that, is that one of Stan's problems was that people didn't compare Stan to other comic book editors, and they didn't compare him, to other media executives. Invariably, they wanted him to behave like Captain America would behave in a given situation,
Right.
And nobody compares that to us. So as I say, aside from people liking the book and recommending buying it and getting this incredible blurb from Jules Pfeiffer, which blew my mind, the fact that even people who may not personally, or who may not have felt Stan treated his collaborators and partners as well as ideally he should have. Even people who didn't like Stan say, the book is fair and very well written and a compelling picture of the guy.
So it's not really a puff piece or anything like that, which is good. It's like, I was wondering if you were able to get Stan to just kind of really be himself in these interviews, because Stan always had this tendency to be kind of grandstanding and self-promoting, because that was like his persona, but were you able to get him to let his guard down?
I think I knew him well enough. Yeah, because he knew I wasn't like somebody calling from like a website or a magazine to get his opinion on the latest Thor movie. It was, he knew, again, to the end, whatever issues he may have had, with people usurping decisions from him and stuff, certainly just on a one-to-one conversation, I certainly knew him long enough and well enough that I could just sit and have a conversation with him.
That's good.
And that persona, that huckster thing, dropped. That was, I hadn't had that situation with him for years, ever. I think he knew me as a peer, not as a peer, whatever, as a colleague, I don't know what you want to call it. He knew me as somebody who worked in the business and worked specifically at Marvel, and then worked, with him at other companies. That was which is not to say that he wasn't capable of giving answers that were, at some points earlier in my relationship with him that were maybe more sugar-coated or more less introspective or something, but that I think had more to do with me, not with him not willing to be frank. That's actually one of the things that I figured out a long time ago, and saw it more and more as time went on, is that Stan, I think, had something in him that compelled him to tell the truth about stuff. Because if you look at any interview, not about any, but a lot of interviews with him, a lot of convention panels, you're right. He will say something that's pretty boilerplate. He's selling stuff. He's a guy who makes stuff to be sold, and he's selling it, and he's got an image, and he's got a point of view. So it'll be like you'll listen to Stan or you'll read a transcript, and it'll be boilerplate, 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 mind-blowing revelation and truthfulness. Boilerplate, boilerplate. Boilerplate, mind-blowing revelation.
Well, I was just saying to think if you got more mind-blowing revelations than boilerplate in your interviews.
Well, I don't know if they were all mind-blowing, but some of them were. But the thing is, and he would do that in public too.
Yeah,
but people wouldn't realize it because he would say it in the same huxter tone of voice.
Right.
He'd be saying,
"True believers,
buy this
Excelsior," and all that.
Right. But then he would just say something incredible, some incredible memory or revelation or admission about something, and you'd kind of. And again, maybe you had to be an insider to really get it. Maybe it was something that if you were 10 years old sitting in the audience, it wouldn't make that much difference. But I had that experience, a lot of times with him where, he was compelled to sort of, one of my things that I remember sort of, he grew up in the Depression, right? His parents, I think he had a very complicated home life. I think his parents had a contentious relationship. They never had a lot of money. And a lot of guys from that generation, especially if they're trying to, be nice, will say things like, well, I had a job after school because I had to help support the family, and I had a kid, everybody had to contribute, and my brother did this, my sister did that, and we all played violin and danced, and people threw quarters, whatever. Everybody got... Stan, in one or two interviews I had seen with him, comes right out and says, well, I was supporting my family, And I'm going, whoa. That's not just, oh, my father wasn't making enough to make ends meet, or my mother was just a house. It was like, holy cow. That's a common for that generation. I know a lot of guys from that generation certainly were out earning their fathers by the time they were in comics. As bad as comics paid, it still paid more than whatever their father was doing.
Right.
But for Stan to really say that, well, I was supporting my family, and it wasn't. He didn't say it in the times that that I read and heard interviews with him. It wasn't like bragging. It wasn't. I think he was almost ashamed of it. I think he would much rather that his father had been a guy who could support the family. So things like that. You would just hear Stan say that. He was an interesting guy. But at least with me personally, and again, I think with pretty much anybody who was in the business or who wasn't just a reporter cold calling him from whatever from whatever media outlet. I think for people in the business, if you got to know him at all, that facade dropped pretty quickly.
That's cool. Now, I know you said it wasn't needing to be authorized, but did he manage to see a completed or near complete manuscript before he passed?
No. He died in November of 2018. The book didn't come out. It wasn't published till November of 2019. So no, he was. And I think I was lucky because I got to him for the book shortly before there were all the wars for control of his life and time. Because at that point, he was still coming into the office regularly. They were in 2017 where I did the two interviews. So there was no. Basically, I said to his assistant, Mike Kelly, who was a terrific guy. I said, Stan. I said I'd love to interview Stan. I said he didn't want to, and eventually, again, I think partly because I've been doing these regular public interviews with Stan, they just set up the appointment, but I didn't have to go through 10 different handlers. And, at the end of his life, I think that, I do go into that in the book about it's not the main topic of the book, but you certainly can't write a book about Stan without all that weird stuff going on in his life in those last year and a half, 2 years. With every other day there'd be a different video with him saying, remember those people I told you to trust last week? Don't trust them. Now trust these people. There was a lot of, unfortunately, I think Stan suffered the fate of a lot of elderly people who've outlived their protectors, and certainly of celebrities. The ones that come to mind, I think Mickey Rooney had similar issues, and Groucho Marx, if any of you listeners remember that far back. These were famous people. They had plenty of money, and yet, somehow they had, usually either outlived or alienated the people who would most logically be the ones who should be looking out for them, and suddenly they're at the mercy of these Hollywood opportunists who would certainly do. They were helpful to these celebrities in certain ways, but also exploitive. And so Stan, so that's in the book. I mean, I think a lot of this is stuff that'll be probably being resolved legally and financially for decades. But I guess as a storyteller, it was great because it gave me all this weird shit to write about in the end of Stan's life. I mean, I felt terrible as a friend of his and a colleague, and just because what I write in the book, another thing that I say in there, which if Stan was kind of the hip uncle or the with it parent or the or just if he was the adult that somehow enjoyed and knew the same pop culture that you did as a kid, so for like the baby boomer and maybe a couple of generations after the boomers, he became this kind of sympathetic and hip older person. Well, then when he got to be elderly himself, he symbolized this other problem that that boomers had is what do we do with our elderly parents? What do we do with Pop? I mean, it's like, well, Stan seems to be competent and be able to make his own decisions. He's not, he's you see him on a convention panel and he's funny and answering questions and giving answers that don't seem like they're just rehearsed or memorized. He really seems with it and alert. So how much with a person like that are they in control of their lives? And if they're not, what do I, as a colleague and fan, there's a guy named Clifford Meth, who you may know or know of, and I think Clifford made a lot of noise in a good way to like the authorities in Los Angeles and stuff, and did stuff behind the scenes that probably I and other people don't know about, and maybe there were other people working too. But I mean, Stan really did become that issue that assuming everybody lives a reasonably long and expected lifespan, is what do you do with an elderly parent who in some cases seems okay and able to make rational decisions, but in other ways seems like they're being exploited or abused. I mean, it's really so I think Stan unfortunately became kind of the poster child or the poster elder for that kind of situation too. So that was, as a storyteller, it was great. As a colleague and friend, it was painful to watch.
Right. And I guess the inevitable question: do you feel that the book came out the best you could do, considering the circumstances and everything you got on the interviews, or is there like some missing piece that you still have unanswered at this point?
I think there are pieces that I think there's more. I mean, as there are other biographies of Stan coming out. I think there is more to Stan's story to be told, and stuff that maybe I wish I'd gone deeper into. I don't know if I mean, I think I went pretty deep. The book is 350. It's 350 pages with over 300 footnotes and endnotes. I think you're writing about Stan Lee. You gotta, it's not an academic book, but I still felt like, I wanted to document and back up anything I said or asserted.
Right.
So I think he had a long, complicated, rich life, and I think there are aspects of it that maybe other people will deal with. So I don't think I guess maybe commercially I should say my book is the last word. There's no more. But I think I did a very good job, and reviews have been very good, and people, I say, have had a lot of praise and compliments about it. But I think Stan had a complicated and long enough life that there's more to be said about him. Have you by any chance read the book? I
have not read it yet, I hate to say, but I definitely want to now. So I was going to say this in response to that. I equate Stan Lee to someone on the level of, say, Charles Schulz or Walt Disney or something like that.
Right.
20 years after Schulz's death, 50 years after Disney's death, they're still writing books about him. So, I mean, it's like they're always going to, so.
Well, I mean, I think, and there's always more to say. It's always a different point of view, because, look, like anybody, some people love Stan and some people hated him. He was the same guy. So what was it? Assuming that the people who hated him, were not insane, which I don't, which for the most part, I don't think they were. Then what was it about him that made? I mean, right? There's facts, and then there's interpretation and how people respond. And just Stan as a collaborator was somebody. To this day, you could ask me, did he and Jack Kirby, were they friends? I don't. I think at times they were. I think at times. I think my book is partly a love story, the Stan and Jack love story, but that's not to say there weren't times that Jack didn't hate him. And there were times he hated him when they were doing their best work together.
Right.
Obviously there's been, Marky Veneer, I guess, is writing what we think will be the definitive biography, but Jack is certainly a guy.
Right.
There could be multiple, but you're right, Stan is in that category, because there's, again, with everybody, it's like, why are some people your friends and some people not your friends? You're the same person. Well, then obviously it has to do with chemistry and individual things that happened or didn't happen. Also, so when we write about celebrities and well-known figures, same kind of thing. But I think there's, so I have a certain, I have what I think is a fair and, an even-handed and compassionate approach to Stan and to Kirby and Ditko, who I grew up idolizing them as much as I did idolizing Stan.
Right.
And I think, I think, without Stan, Ditko, Kirby, and Martin Goodman, there's no Marvel Comics. I think you take any one of those elements out, there's no Marvel Comics.
I agree with that.
But so I think there's other interpretations and probably other things to be investigated, and other people. There's a guy named J.L. Mast, who's a French artist who's done a bunch of work for Marvel, and he's, I think he's in his 20s, and I've known him through social media, and I met him. He came to New York a few weeks ago, just before we all got quarantined, and he's doing astonishing research. He's doing a graphic novel, or maybe a series of graphic novels about Stan and about Martin Goodman. And he came up with research that he was nice enough to share some of it with me. But somehow he found relatives and cousins and just stuff about Stan and Martin's lives, and that'll be really interesting when his graphic novels come out. So I think there's there are many more levels. What I tried to do with the book is make it have enough depth about comics that it would satisfy people who knew their comics history, but not so much that people who didn't, quote unquote civilians. I didn't want it to be a book that was so inside baseball, So I tried to structure it really almost like a novel, and with a cliffhanger at the end of every chapter. And again, luckily Stan's life did kind of lend itself to that. So it's, so in a way, it's as much a book about the comic business.
Yeah.
There's, again, not to give. There's plenty about Stan. Even people who know a lot about Stan, will come up to me and say, "I have no idea." There's plenty there. But I think, I think there's a lot there. As you said, like any interesting and key cultural figure, public figure, there's always more to find out and other interpretations.
Right. So what's next for Danny Fingeroth? Are you working on another biography or anything else at this time, or?
Well, I mean, because I figured it wasn't, again, I don't want to, when I tell you the topic, you'll see why I'm giving this preamble, because I figured it wasn't controversial enough writing about who did what at Marvel Comics in the 60s, I thought I'd write a book about the Kennedy assassination. Oh. So I'm writing a biography of Jack Ruby, the guy who killed Lee Harvey Oswald.
Interesting.
I've actually written a graphic novel about Ruby that Rick Geary is attached to, and we've been trying to get that off the ground for years. It's one of those books where people go, if you had a copy right here, I'd buy it, but I can't back it as a publisher. It's like, well, don't you think if you'd want to buy it anyway? So that's one incarnation of it. There's been interest expressed, and including by me, in doing it as a biography of Jack Ruby, who is so famous for that one photo of him killing Oswald, and yet very little is known about the guy. So he had a bizarrely interesting life, and knew this wide range of people in politics and in show business, and so I'm writing a book, and of course, again, I don't want to trivialize the Kennedy assassination by comparing it to who created Spider-Man, but I mean,
wow,
there are many more. If people are passionate about who created Spider-Man, then certainly there are people passionate about who really killed JFK and who, and why Ruby. So I'm kind of wading through those waters and trying to come up with a reasonable point of view on Ruby's life, which was a crazy, one of the taglines I've been playing with is killing Lee Harvey Oswald was not the craziest thing Jack Ruby ever did, so...
That's a good type.
It's a life story in which Mickey Mantle, Hank Williams, Frank Sinatra, all these people that you would think might not necessarily intersect with like a high-strung and weird strip club owner would interact with. I mean, so the guy had this really interesting life, and he happened to change history on in front of like 100 million people on television.
Yes,
too,
live.
so that's my next big project. That of course with our current coronavirus world, who knows what anybody's next project is? But that's what I'm focusing on.
I mean, it gives us all a chance to write. I mean, that's why I've taken on other projects myself. I go
right, of course. Well, I mean, if we should come through this, then and I guess one way or another we will. Then then people. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've been consuming more media the past few weeks than I have in probably the 3 years before that. So I guess those of us who make media, have to keep going on in the hopes that there'll be somebody around to buy it and read it.
Yeah. Well, like I said, that's one of the reasons I'm doing these podcasts. To give people something else to listen to if they've listened to all the other thousands and of podcasts out there. Do you have any other magazines? Like you said a couple times that you were the editor of Right Now, and I used to buy that on occasion. Were there? Do you have any other magazines or comics in the planning at this time, or just books?
Not right now. I'm really focusing on the Ruby thing. I did do the audiobook of A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee. So that audiobook is available from all the regular sources. There's a large typed version, and it's been translated into a dozen languages. But that took some time. Doing the audiobook was an interesting experience, and again, I've had some compliments on that, and I'm available for audiobook work.
Okay.
No, right now I'm focusing mainly on the Ruby proposal. I have a couple of other projects that, as we like to say, I'm not ready to talk about
Right.
yet.
No,
But,
that's fine.
I had a bunch of, probably like yourself, I had a lot of public speaking engagements and conventions lined up,
Yeah.
and I was honored to be selected as a special guest for this year's San Diego Con, which I guess is 50-50 whether it'll actually happen or not. So had a lot of stuff planned, but
I had to put disclaimers. I'm a little bit ahead always on the podcast, and I had to put disclaimers on the ones I'm uploading now because it was before all this happened. They said, "Well, I'm going to be here, and I'm going to be here." It's like, sorry, they're not going to be anywhere. At home. So.
Exactly. No, it's and the paperback of the A Marvelous Life is due to come out in September.
Well,
but I think people need it now.
Yes. Well, you sold me on it. I mean, I've always liked Stan Lee's life. I do have his autobiography. I do have other books by him. He's always a fascinating person to me. I do sympathize with the people who say, "Oh, Ditko and Kirby got screwed" or whatever. But at the same time, I go, hey, it's Stan. It's like, he wasn't always a nice guy. I hate to say, but he wasn't a villain either. He was just, being Stan.
He was looking at. I mean, like most people, he was looking out for himself and his family. I mean, if he had behaved like Captain America, if he had done the most right thing every single time, sure, that would have been. Everybody would prefer that. But there were, I think. I think he, compared to a lot of people and a lot of people in comics, he was quite generous and gracious and giving. But ultimately, it came down to him or somebody else. He was going to go with him. But there were there's a million stories about things he did for people, and I mean that's what makes him interesting.
He certainly entertained a lot of people, so that you can't knock that.
Look, he was. There was. He couldn't have done what he did without collaborators, but without him, the stuff wouldn't have existed the way it did and achieved the. We wouldn't be. As important as all those other people were, without Stan, we wouldn't be talking about any of that stuff.
Right.
Kirby and Ditko would be, I think, loved and admired by a hardcore of comics fans, and Goodman might be known among, business students in business schools, or maybe among people who are interested in the history of pulps. But I think. They were all invaluable, but certainly Stan somehow had the vision and the ability to carry it out, not without some broken hearts and broken dishes along the way.
Well, I think that's basically all I have to ask at this time. Do you have a website or anything?
I have a website, DannyFingeroth.com. DannyFingeroth.com. I'm on Facebook, Twitter. I'm going to be trying. I think if somebody wants an autographed copy of the book, they can contact me through the website, and I will try to get it to them. I mean, who knows how Post Office, FedEx, and so on will be operating, but. I'll be doing. I'm doing a online presentation about the book on April 7th, which is before this airs.
Yeah.
But through Ben Catcher's New York Comic Picture Story Symposium. But I imagine it'll be archived after that, so people can find that. And I'll put it on the info on my website. But yeah, I mean, like everybody, I think I'm going to have to figure out ways to interact with people online. So just check out my website, and especially check out. I'd say I'm most active on Facebook. As Danny Fingeroth, and that's it. So thank you for your interest and for doing this.
Thank you for listening, and thank you, Danny Fingeroth, for being my special guest. Episode number 76 will be coming soon. If you would like to comment and or be a guest on this podcast, please drop me a line at funideas.mark@gmail.com. Become a Patreon of Mark Arnold and Fun Ideas Productions. If everyone listening just contributed $1 a month, that would be a tremendous help in continuing the production of my books and this podcast. Also, subscribe to my YouTube channel. The opening and closing music for the Fun Ideas podcast is provided courtesy of Andrew the Slow Poisoner Goldfarb and is used with permission. This has been the Fun Ideas podcast. This is Mark Arnold speaking. This episode is copyright 2020, Fun Ideas Productions. Thank you, and good night.
Headed home to a cardboard hut with duct tape doors. At the price I'm paying, be glad it isn't yours. Now get up, Crab Mountain, get up. 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 That mountain of crab. And don't fall back. Don't fall back. Don't fall